Is it fine? Am I talking then? Okay. 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 Assalamualaikum and a very good morning to everyone, or evening to Rob. Good morning and welcome, and thank you everyone for your time. First and foremost, we appreciate it. Welcome to the International Islamic University, a hamlet of sincerity, of safeness, peace, right? We're gathered here, of course, through the reason of, I think, pure Aristotelian friendship. I think this is, if I could just summarize it very quickly for everyone, this is why we're here. Of course, in IIU, or in the International Islamic University, there are no VCs here, no vice chancellors. Here we have a rector. And of course, the community here, we're very sort of very strongly inclined towards the concept of Rahmatan lil Alamin, which is essentially just peace and mercy to all. So we're very happy to welcome Dr. Robert and of course audiences in the crowd. I know we have about at least upwards of 100 people present today from across the globe, I would say, because again, the Ummah and generally the university were from different places. And we're very happy to be in situations like this, and of course we're neighbors, and we would love to know more and more about our neighbors. So hopefully we'll have a fiery discussion, and not a cold one, something away from tunnel vision, right? So what will happen is that I'll pass the floor very quickly to a representative of the conflict circle. She'll say a few words very quickly, and then I'll introduce Rob, set the stage for the discussion today. And then Rob says he's very inclined for questions, and hopefully we'll spend most of our time at. And if it's all fine and there are no questions at this point, let's invite Zuleika to say a few words.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Meor. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and good morning to Dr. Robert. Thank you to each and every one of you for being here with us today. We are very pleased to welcome all of you to this webinar series co-conducted by Secretariat of Political Science, IIUM, and the PSCI 4311 Conflict Circle, Studies of International Terrorism, in collaboration with IIUM World Debate and Oratory Center, IWON. It is a good webinar series for us to gain more knowledge about the conflict studies. As a representative from Studies of International Terrorism class, I am Zuleika Shah, would like to express my gratitude to our first distinguished guest, Dr. Robert J. Thompson III from United States of America. Welcome to the first webinar series on global conflict, Dr. Rob. It is a great pleasure to learn more about the pacification of the Phu Yen and the American war in Vietnam. As you all know, more discussion like this will bring stronger understanding about the history of the global conflicts, such as the Vietnam War and its significance, and help us also to learn about the strategies and the tactics for the peace buildings and for the pacifications. With that, I hope at the end of this webinar, all of us will gain something beneficial from. Without further ado, I would like to now pass the floor back to Dr. Meor Alif, our beloved lecturer and moderator for today's discourse. Don't forget to share your questions at the text box at the end of the webinar. I think that's all from me. Have fun. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you, Zuleika. Thank you very much. To set the discussion, right, as leader for the discussion today, I'm inclined, or I'm minded to begin with a domino of 3 quotes, right, to sort of set the stage, and then I'll pass it on to Dr. Rob. So I think the first one, and this applies for everyone in the group, we're always minded to think about E.H. Carr when we speak about historiography. We think about E.H. Carr. The historian is himself a type of chef. He goes out, he purchases the fish from the market, he returns, he cooks the fish as he pleases or as he wishes. and then you get history, or at least a discipline of roughly how it works, that you go out and you fix your own sort of dish as a result of it. That's one sort of perspective to keep in mind. Another one, of course, more related to the type of history we'll be speaking about is, of course, a quote from Herodotus himself, right? In histories, of course, he describes Persian attacks, the moment of the Persian attack on Miletus, somewhere near Turkey, and here we hear in histories, a very interesting excerpt or paragraph which I love to share with everyone. It goes something like this: "Men of Ionia, now is the fit time to show your zeal for the house of the king. Use your best efforts, every one of you, to detach your fellow countrymen from the general body. Hold forth to them the promise that if they submit, no harm shall happen to them on account of their rebellion. Their temples shall not be burned, nor any of their private buildings, neither shall they be treated with greater harshness than before the outbreak. But if they refuse to yield and determine to try the chance of a battle, threaten them with the fate which shall assuredly overtake them in that case. Tell them when they are vanquished in fight, they shall be enslaved. Their boys shall be made eunuchs, their maidens transported to Bactria, while their country shall be delivered into the hands of the foreigner." That's one, that's the second domino. And then the final one, I think, best to keep in mind when we speak about things like this, is of course to hear from Plato himself, right? Because he, in explaining this notion of having to secure oneself or one's political community, he goes on to explain the following. He says, if of course that the I can find it. Yeah, so he says, strictly speaking that that we should reserve the term guardian in its fullest sense, their function being to see that friends at home shall not wish nor foes abroad be able to harm our state, while the young men whom we have been describing as guardians should more strictly be called auxiliaries, their functions being to assist the rulers in the execution of their decisions. So I think where we enter is somewhere within this ballpark of historiography. We know Carr, we know the activity of making and sort of doing history. We know the general dynamics of belligerency and so on. And of course, we're interested in knowing how to progress in the future, and based on experiences over the past 2-3 decades or so, especially in conflicts which are close to heart. Perhaps we'll learn something. Maybe today we'll put an end finally to some needless confusions over pacifism, pacification, and the Pacific. Maybe that's one possibility, right? Or maybe we'll end up discussing more about how perhaps sometimes no declaration of war, but a president with broad powers may well just be a type of declaration of war, and so on. So we'll hear from Dr. Robert Thompson. He has a book coming out, right? It's on pre-order. I'm sure he will speak about it even more. That's of course why we're here anyway. He's with the Army University Press. If you have questions over, of course, his line of work as well, I think he will be more than welcome to explain, how things work in his sort of field and so on. So, without dominating the discussion so much, I gracefully and very happily invite Rob to take the stage. Thank you very much.
Oh, first, thank you all very much for the warm welcome and for having me here in the first place. This is already, I think, going to be a great evening. Well, evening for me. I should say good morning to all of you. Before I get started, since I work for the US government, they like it if I make sure that I'm only speaking for myself. So everything I'm about to say, the views expressed are those of myself and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the Department of the Army or the US government. Now with that out of the way, I can get a little bit more into who I am, what I do, some background information. I work for Army University Press. I help make films that educate viewers on U.S. Army history and doctrine. I've helped produce films that dealt with the Korean War. We're working on films that deal with the Second World War in the Philippines. So I can talk a little bit about that if there's any questions. It's actually fun. I get to do history. It's not every person who goes through everything I did ends up actually getting to do history. So I feel very fortunate. Let's see. So I finished my PhD in American history in 2016 at the University of Southern Mississippi. And that is where this book started. It was originally my dissertation topic under the direction of Dr. Andrew Wiest, who's written extensively about Vietnam. Initially, a study of Phu Yen was on his to-do list. At Southern Miss, we have papers from a veteran, and that's really where Phu Yen came into like my knowledge. The veteran was in the province in like 1971. He took extensive notes and reports, and when he left, he had no idea why the war had gone so poorly in this one particular place. And that was the original question I sought to answer. And that made me go all the way back to 1963, 64, trying to look at when the Americans first get to Vietnam. And then I realized, well, history doesn't happen in a vacuum. So where did the French try first? And then the further I kept digging back, I realized the project was getting too big. So for the book, I give just enough information to put Phu Yen in the context of pacification and war in general. I found that a lot of people had tried to pacify the province, including the Americans. And that was something that interests me. Couldn't pursue it too much, but I realized that the Americans had pretty much tried to do what the French tried to do, and the French tried to do what the Viets before them had tried to do. And it was interesting that everyone basically tried to subjugate Phu Yen, and in the end, I think the only ones who were able to do it were the Vietnamese themselves. But I can answer questions about that later, if there are any. I don't remember So Bernard Fall made a comment before his death that Americans were falling into the same traps in the same places in Vietnam that the French had before them. And that resonated with me because initially I thought, well, that's not true. But then the more I studied Vietnam, the more I wrote about Phu Yen, the more I realized that he was right. So if we look at Phu Yen during the first Indochina War, when the French are trying to keep it as an overseas colony, there's an Operation Atlante, where they invade Phu Yen, and they try to bring it under French control, but they ultimately fail. And then Dien Bien Phu happens, and so then nothing matters anymore. It's basically now just the French trying to save what they can, but the war is over. And oddly enough, if you fast forward to 1965, 66, the Americans do the same thing. They're able to stay a little bit longer. So right away, my focus, before I really tried to get into what pacification was this idea of like conventional warfare and its relationship to pacification. So the historiography of the Vietnam War typically says there are two different things, that there are two wars. There's the war, which is conventional warfare. So think armies after each other. And then there's the other war, which is pacification or anything but conventional warfare. And that always struck me as odd that there could be two separate things going on. I was like, it never made sense. So for the dissertation, I sought out to figure out that relationship, and trying to figure out that relationship caused me to try to then figure out what does pacification mean. So in the dissertation and in the book, I have one chapter just on what does pacification mean, because depending on the American you asked or the South Vietnamese official you asked, the answer was different. And it was interesting to go through papers. I went through like Edward Lansdale's papers. He was the American that supposedly was the only one that Meor Alif would listen to. So Edward Lansdale was known for being able to talk to people. It was always it was always odd how people treated Edward Lansdale, but what he comes to matter because of his records. So he had papers that basically let me follow this conversation in Saigon about what pacification meant to certain people at certain times. And not to spend too much time on this, but basically at the end of the day, security mattered more. I found that was like the first issue that was raised in all these reports, or at least all this correspondence where you had various US embassy staff saying, well, pacification means this, or it means that. But usually the first thing they talked about was security. Like you have to secure the physical countryside, you have to secure the people. And then it kind of boiled down to, well, we have to secure their loyalty. And it ultimately, pacification means control. So security matters, but you're trying to control people. You like the Saigon government wants to control the people in Phu Yen so that they do what the Saigon government wants them to do. And then to give the National Liberation Front, Hanoi, the communist agency here, they're kind of trying to do the same thing. They're trying to control the people so they do what they want. So the people are caught between, Hanoi and Saigon. And so, yeah, pacification, control, it's probably not groundbreaking for like the historiography, but I found that it really helped explain what pacification meant. That Americans and South Vietnamese officials, you don't want to say, oh, you're trying to control people. It's like, oh, we're trying to, pacify. We're trying to get rid of the Viet Cong that are in the area, or what have you. The interesting thing about pacification is that the Americans pick up the word from the French, and we're going back to like the 19th century. But for the South Vietnamese, because the French used it so much, they didn't like the word. So they went with something that was more catchy, originally revolutionary development. And that lasted for a little while before they changed it to rural development. But it's the same idea, just two words instead of one. So with that in mind, that pacification was control, that brought me back to the initial question of conventional warfare's relationship with pacification. And I found that they both work together, and what happened in Phu Yen demonstrated that, and that conventional warfare helped make pacification look like it was working. And that was the biggest takeaway. So Phu Yen at the end of 1964 into 1965 did not look too good for Saigon. After the assassination of Meor Alif, the strategic hamlet program had fallen apart. Hanoi had sent conventional units, PAVN, down throughout South Vietnam, and they were able to, along with the PLAF, or the People's Liberation Armed Forces, to overrun a lot of the strategic hamlets that were still around. And in the case of Phu Yen, they controlled almost the entire province except for Tuy Hoa City, the province capital. And that's when, end of December 1965, January 1966, you have the US Army's 1st Field Force Vietnam send in like mobile units. You get like the 101st Airborne, like a lot of these famous 173rd, a lot of these famous American units come through, and the whole objective is to push the communists away from the province capital and give pacification some breathing room. In the case of Fujian, what matters most is control of rice production. So everything's focused on one valley, the Tuiwa Valley. So if you've seen the book cover, that's the Tuiwa Valley. Those are rice farmers being interrogated by US Army soldiers. And so they're all basically trying to control the rice. And so as long as the US Army is present and actively pushing deeper into the province, pacification looks like it's working. And that's how it looks for 66, 67. By the end of 1967, you have the formation of cords, and that is this civilian military body that combines US Army and you could say like what would it be? Foreign affairs together, so that they're both working for the same ends. They can use each other's resources, because before that you had the US Army doing its own pacification and you had a civilian entity kind of doing the same. So they put them together. And CORD is important because they have really, really good reporting. They help validate my argument that security is what matters most to pacification, and the people who bring security is the conventional forces, whether they're American, South Korean, South Vietnamese. And so they're the driving force behind what looks like pacification success. And then by the end of 1967, you also have US Army generals saying the war is won in this region. Like, we've seen our last major actions, like it's over, like we did a good job, like pat yourselves on the back. Well, I imagine everyone knows what happens in January of 1968. We have the Tet Offensive, and that pretty much dispels any notion of the war being close to being won by South Vietnam. And it also does a lot of damage to pacification. The historiography paints Tet as this military victory for the US Army and the South Vietnamese, but a long-term victory for Hanoi, because the US loses the will to stay, because then we get like Vietnamization or the American withdrawal from Vietnam, and handing most of the war fighting over to the South Vietnamese. Well, there's something wrong with that, because when you read the reports from like Fujian, they talk about how the Tet Offensive sets pacification back by months. And that's just from 2 months of fighting in the province. That doesn't account for the fighting that continues into 69, 70. And so where the Tet Offensive really matters, in that one, it's should be seen as Hanoi's victory against pacification. And what helps that make more sense is that, so the Tet Offensive happens, the US mistakenly thinks that the enemy is without enough manpower to keep going, they're on the run. And I can speak more as why that's also wrong. But they come up with like this notion that now we have an opportunity to spread pacification fast and quickly. And that's where we get the Accelerated Pacification Campaign, or APC. And that was, historiography has treated that as a success, that the US could help the South Vietnamese pacify areas that were once hotly contested. But what it fails to take into account is that the National Liberation Front, Hanoi, they all push back against it. That what you've effectively done is given South Vietnam more contested territory to secure, while also removing the US Army units that helped place that territory nominally under Saigon's control. And so you have ARVN, you have the territorial forces of South Vietnam all spread really thinly against an enemy that's now reverting to terrorist attacks. And that's pretty much the scene end of 1969. Like the reports in Phu Yen are indicating like, hey, the PLF has kind of shifted tactics. Like they're still engaging in battle when they want to, but they're focused on more so on terrorism, like reminding the population that they still exist, that they haven't been defeated. And then, let's see, we get into 1970, and that's the time period that I'm the most interested in, because it's this time where the US really, really wants to be out of Vietnam, but yet has all these commitments it still has to fulfill. And then you start seeing the fruits of all this poorly constructed labor. So that's when the APC shows that it's really just more like a name than anything that's supposed to be permanent. So when the PLAF had shifted tactics, it shifted to terrorism, mostly because economy of force, and it also let them remind the population they were still there. A part of that was actually abducting civilians for like re-education, taking them into the mountains for indoctrination, letting them know, hey, once the Americans are gone, we're gonna move in. So you better get ready for, a new government, a new way of life. And these abductions reached hundreds. I think in 1 month, there's like 600 abductions, which for Phu Yen, that's quite a bit. That's a couple villages. So the American advisors don't catch wind of that until like March or so. And they find that the South Vietnamese officials in Phu Yen were not reporting those abductions. For whatever, and I could not really pinpoint the exact reason the South Vietnamese didn't want to report them. So I didn't really speak to any of that in the book. But what did become apparent was the scale blew away the Americans. It was such high numbers that they realized the PLAF had access to just about every hamlet, every village, even the capital city itself to some degree, that they were able to move in, abduct people, and move out without coming into any contact with government forces. And that's what really surprised them, is that the entire security apparatus they had helped put in place was a sieve. And that led to a whole lot of issues. The US Army did not want to go back into Phu Yen. You had the South Koreans who had just left the province to do operations in the other places that weren't doing so well. And ARVN had left the province too to do operations elsewhere. So the PLF basically made the move at the perfect time. And then the fallout results in the Allies scrambling, trying to mount operations to resecure the province, while the Americans send a training force, a task force rather, to go back, retrain the territorial forces. That ends in complete disaster. The book starts with this opening scene of 7 American advisors, their bodies being laid out in front of a school in the province after their unit had been overrun by the PLAF, and that kind of like set the tone for the rest of the American war in Vietnam, at least in Phu Yen. And I came away with the sense that the Americans had gave up after that incident, that they were just trying to get by until Washington, D.C. removed them from the province. And so 1970 is the year when pacification is pretty much a failed endeavor in Phu Yen. 1971, things don't get any better. There's still abductions. There's always a noticeable amount of PLF activity. We get to 1972, and that year reporting's really, really short because the Americans know they're getting out. There's the peace talks happening, and then once they catch, once it becomes apparent that there's definitely going to be some kind of accord, Accords and all these other reporting entities are basically at bare minimum. They're not doing a lot of reporting anymore. And so the few reports I got were actually pretty good. There's a remark from one American province advisor. He's like, we have no idea just how much of this place the South Vietnamese government controls. It's like there's places in Phu Yen that no advisor has been to in 2 years. And so they're leading a province that they have no idea what's going on in most of it. And that struck me as really interesting because a friend of mine, Thomas Richardson, wrote a book about the Australian experience in Phuoc Toi, which is 400 or 500 miles south of Phu Yen, and then totally different Army administrative zone. The Australians there, when they left, mentioned that they had no idea just what they had done. Right? There wasn't really much to show for all the years of fighting and the human suffering. And for me, I found basically the American version of that in Phu Yen, them saying at the end, and we don't know what we've done. There's really not much to show for all this chaos. And so that's pretty much where the American story ends. That's how the dissertation ended. For the book, I was asked to go a little bit further and talk about, well, what happens once the Americans leave? We all know what happens in April 1975, South Vietnam ceases to exist. And so in Phu Yen, you're able to see that wasn't necessarily inevitable. History is not inevitable. There's 1973 called, there's 4 or 5 different terms for it. One of them is land grab. That's these skirmishes between Hanoi and Saigon's forces, even though they're technically under a truce. Before it goes into effect, they're fighting over control of territory because the Paris Peace Accords allowed Hanoi's forces to remain on the territory they occupied. And in Phu Yen, it goes really well for Saigon. They're able to reclaim, ARVN's able to reclaim some territory. So that's a bright spot. But then in 74 into 75, there's strategic blunders that are committed under the TU government, and Phu Yen falls really, really quick. There's one last battle in Tuiwa City, but then the war is over for Phu Yen pretty quickly. And so that's just kind of a quick brief overview of the war in Phu Yen. But the most important thing I noticed was that once the Americans leave in 1970, there's really no security left for pacification. There's a newspaper article from the time that said it pretty much the Vietnamese, their average the South Vietnamese citizen realized they were caught in between 2 fates that they didn't really have much control over, and they were kind of in a waiting game. Who's actually going to be the one that governs us? And just waiting it out. There were rumors that maybe in 1970 the province government was trying to get along with the PLAF. That's why they weren't reporting abductions. That they were trying to play both sides because everyone knew the Americans were going to leave eventually. And so I think that pretty much covers the book. There's a lot of other little things I can get into, specifics. I think I have some. And can probably talk a little bit where the book title comes from. So clear, hold, and destroy. An editor came up with that one. I can't take credit. I wish I could. But in 1970, 71, Robert Comer, who was one of the architects of CORDS, America's early understanding of pacification, he wrote an article, Clear, Hold, Build. The premise there was you had to clear out the enemy. You had to hold on to it to show the people that they were going to be secure. And then you helped rebuild, or in some cases, develop. As the editor pointed out to me in Fujian, it's like, yeah, they cleared, they tried to hold it, but ultimately everything was like destroyed, like pacification itself was. So that's where the title comes from. I think that's pretty cool, especially, I can make one final point about pacification too. This one's getting a little deep into it, but I know maybe some people appreciate it, is that they're like, if you boil it down to the basics, pacification, some people would argue either it's supposed to build up. And so you have like this, you have to build before you can like break or destroy something. And then you have others, well, you have to destroy first, then build. And there's some pretty cool quotes that I found about that. Like, you know, if you don't destroy if you don't get rid of what you don't like first, then you're basically, you're wasting your labor. You can't build on a bad foundation. So that stuck with me too. It's something that I'm still interested in, and that kind of like that idea of like pacification either is nice or it's inherently destructive. I think if you read my book, you'll come away thinking that it's definitely destructive. It destroys a lot, and it has to at least destroy the enemy's ability to interact with the population. So I can speak more to that if there's questions about it. Other than that, I mean, if there's anything anyone would like me to address further, I'm happy to, or I can answer questions.
Okay, I think we'll go into questions. So what we'll do is, if you have a question to pose, I think you can raise your hand as someone in charge, sort of, then turn on your audio, just don't hit and run, say your name, and then just ask a question, and then we'll see how it goes. So if that's okay, we'll proceed with the question session, please. Anyone then who has something to say? Anyone here? Is there something in the chat? I'll have a look at the chat. Okay, there's a first question. We'll get the ball rolling, and then perhaps we'll take one from the crowd next. Or would you rather, do you want one at a time, or would you rather have it in a group, Rob? I think we'll go one at a time.
One at a time is fine. Yeah, whatever works best for you.
Okay, yeah, it's fine. So we have one from Enrico. He's from the ARC community media from Indonesia. Welcome. The question goes, what is your opinion? What is your opinion on the troop surge in relation to the effectiveness of such policy to pacification efforts in general?
Thank you, Enrico. That's a good question. I think there's an idea that more troops means better results. I think you see that the U.S. invasion of Iraq. There's like the famous surge. It supposedly made everything better. But if we think about like Vietnam, I think if you understand that conventional warfare is supposed to drive pacification, or at least give it that perception that it works, I think when you say there's like when you add more troops to that, it helps give that appearance like, oh, it requires more labor, but then look at the progress. But I think everything's temporal. Because probably, I think so. There's like in a way there's like a mini surge in Fujian when the Americans arrive. Everything looks like it's doing better, but as they remove them, then you start seeing the problems. Like that didn't fix everything. It helped create new conditions, but the problems themselves are still there. Does that make sense?
Okay. Anyone else? Maybe
Yeah,
a follow-up, Majid? Yeah.
I have a question. Hello, my name is Dr. Majid, and this question has been raised by multiple students, and it was concerned about why the US goal got shifted from fighting communism to fighting to avoid humiliation. How did or why did they let this happen to them?
It's a great question. So if we look at like the Johnson administration, it's definitely trying to win a war that they probably deep down know is unwinnable. It's not theirs to win. So there's an issue of how do you fight a war you know you can't win, and then how do you kind of remove yourself from it? I think the Johnson administration struggled with that. They could not find a way to bring Hanoi to negotiations, because for Hanoi there has to be a unified Vietnam under their control. When you have the Nixon administration, I think they accept that they're not going to win Vietnam, and so they're trying to find a way to make losing Vietnam okay. And that's when they realize that if they open dialogue with Beijing, that one, communism isn't monolithic. It's not all being run out of Moscow, that these different communist countries are independent. A lot of them make their own decisions. And if the US can talk with Beijing, then Vietnam doesn't matter as much. Vietnam can go communist, but now they can communicate with them individually. So I think they termed it like peace with honor, but it's basically they're abandoning Vietnam for larger global benefits. So they don't, because the Nixon administration comes away thinking that the Johnson administration had been too focused on one spot in Southeast Asia, and the Nixon administration realizes that things are global. There's much bigger things going on, and that's where the basically new discourse with China comes in.
Okay. Anyone else in the crowd? Is there? Prof. Ishtia is on. Prof. Ishtia, he's with the department. You're on mute, Prof. You have to unmute as well. You're on mute, Prof.
So many things going on now. Everything is on on cyber. Anyway, I thank you very much, Dr. Robert, for such an interesting talk. I think that our students, or rather my students, would really benefit, because this is something that we never talk about. It might surprise you to know that the Vietnam War is never talked about. I do it once in a while because my area of research was Vietnam, Indochina during my doctoral dissertation. Now I have several actually questions for you. Maybe the students can, you can respond. And I think it's one way of making sure that our students actually learn. First of all, I think as far as I know, the pacification program was first of all introduced in Malaya during the emergency period by Sir Robert Thompson, and it worked. And that's where the Americans got the idea, and they tried to apply it in Vietnam, which didn't work. I don't know about you, but I think it didn't work. In fact, the pacification program was interpreted as subjugation. And as a result, you have My Lai massacre and countless others. And I think the American military, the US military, still has this tendency, and you can see that happening in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and elsewhere in the world. So did the Australians. Just look at the recent report, the Australian Special Forces, what they did in Afghanistan. So I think it has become part of culture in the military. And I would like to know what kind of steps have the American military taken to rectify this. The other thing is pacification didn't work because of the fact that the people in Vietnam really did not support. You actually didn't mention about the strong nationalist feeling in Vietnam about the reunification. I think that part really played a very important role. But then again, the point that I'm trying to make is, what's the point of discussing pacification now? What's the relevance with regard to current American military operations in different parts of the world? Can you please enlighten us on this? Thank you.
Oh, thank you for those questions. So yeah, the U.S. Does try to, it sees the Malaya emergency as a good example, like, see, we can do this. They know like the French had failed in Vietnam, but like the British, the Commonwealth countries, they proved it can work. But then the geography and the government, a lot of the different factors make Vietnam really hard to compare to Malaya in terms of South Vietnam is so much more porous. It's hard to control the borders. And I think that this helps also explain the US Army's lessons from Vietnam. The first thing it takes from Vietnam is that it went really, really bad. Basically, let's not talk about it anymore. And so shortly after the war, probably the early 80s at least, American officers who were writing memoirs are trying to say, well, we were winning it at the time I was there, or we would have won it if we did this. That's all fanciful, but the US Army pretty much decided not to talk about it, or not even really analyze it anymore. They wrote the official histories, but they weren't teaching the Vietnam War. They weren't really looking back, trying to figure out what went wrong, why, what they could do better. Instead, they decided that conventional warfare was the future. And so by the time of the first Gulf War, that validates it. Operation Desert Storm validates that. Pacification, that's in the past. Air-land battle, big conventional warfare, that's like Second World War type. That's the future. That's what we're going to focus on. That's all that matters. Of course, September 11th happens and it changes everything. Then the US Army is like, oh yeah, we should look back for historical examples of what to do for lower intensity conflicts. And it's like, oh, Vietnam, I'm not sure they took away the right lessons. I've been told that they looked at the advisory effort in Vietnam and tried to model what they did in Afghanistan and Iraq on that. I'm not entirely sure. A lot of those documents aren't out yet. And so I can't really say the US Army has tried to figure out what it could do better in terms of pacification. I think now, because my country's been at this war on terror has been going on for almost 20 years now.
Yeah.
It's crazy to say out loud. It blows my mind that now they're tired of thinking about lower intensity conflicts. So like pacification is out of, it's not something they want to talk about again. And so the short window we've had in the Army to discuss Vietnam is priority closed. I'm hoping that now that I work for them, I can maybe convince them somehow, because I think they need that healthy dialogue so that maybe in the future that we won't even try it again. I think it's a difficult conversation that needs to be had, and maybe hopefully in the open. I'm not too sure. Of course, I'm probably getting off point. And then, sorry, I think was another question that I'm not answering right now.
Yeah, my point was, we take the lessons from history, isn't it? So that we don't repeat the same kind of mistakes. But it seems to me that the US Army, when you look at its operations in the Middle East, especially after 9/11, it seems to me that they really did not outweigh that mentality, the subjugation. Right. That's what we see in Iraq. Right. Let me tell you, for example, Why is it that Americans actually try to learn after something nasty had happened? Look at his operations in Afghanistan. They didn't know about the local culture. I think in a superpower like the US, I mean, it's bewildering to me that they didn't understand the local culture. When you look at its operations in Iraq, hardly anybody spoke Arabic. So how do you communicate with the people? Same thing with the diplomats. But I know that area studies was once upon a time very important in American universities. How could that happen? Really?
That's a great point. Yeah. Well, the Americans first arrived in what was then Indochina to observe and advise the French. They were culturally ignorant then too. They didn't understand anything about Vietnam. They didn't even understand really how the French colonial apparatus worked. They came in thinking, hey, we helped win that recent world war. We're more powerful than the French, certainly more so than the Vietnamese. Like, we know what we think is right. Their views, their ideas don't matter because they don't work. There are books that talk about how that really, really sets everything off the wrong way early on. I think Cauldron and Resistance is a good book that gets into that the French tell the Americans, don't do this, don't do that. And the American response is, well, what do you guys know? You're the reason why we're here. And I think that mentality is maybe, I want to say quintessentially American, but it's definitely a problem. Just thinking that since we're a superpower, that we're superior somehow, and that local cultures don't matter because we're there to fix them. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, the U.S. has probably learned this lesson at least 3 times, and it hasn't stuck. I'm not sure what the future holds for it. I'm not sure there's ever going to be enough conversation about what to do differently. Because I think, despite evidence that shows that conventional warfare and like pacification have a symbiotic relationship, pacification is boring. It's not, you don't get it. It requires a lot of work. It requires interacting with politicians, locals. It's not as glorious as, I guess, it's not what you don't play a video game for pacification. It's not it doesn't look like Call of Duty, so it's not what anyone really wants to do. And that's unfortunate, because I think if there's any lessons to be learned maybe from the communist perspective, it's that maybe less is more. There's some great books out on how the Chinese assisted North Vietnam. And I guess being subtle has a lot of value, and the US might want to look at how did the other side benefit from more subtle advisement.
I like the idea of a Call of Duty stakeholder management game. Is it difficult, Rob, to be on the learning side of things? I think the discussion seems to suggest that there's a lot of learning. And what are the challenges? Is it difficult?
Yeah, I think it's at least for the United States, it's always like going back on winning the Second World War, maybe downplaying the role of the Soviet Union and maybe the other allies to an extent. And I think when you get Korea and you get like this draw, you didn't lose, but you didn't win. And I think that's one book characterizes that. You have this American empire, and that's where it takes its first knee, is in Korea, but it's still pretty high on itself. And then you get to Vietnam, and then it falls down on its other knee, and then that's when it kind of realizes that it can't do everything. That in this case, it can't come away with anything but failure. And I think that it's really hard to learn because you've not set yourself up, like metaphorically, US hasn't set itself to learn because it's never seen a reason before. And so instead of trying to learn from Vietnam, the response was to ignore it, that it was an outlier, that wasn't the normal. You have the mantra of no more Vietnams. By the time of the Gulf War, I believe President Bush says, you know, that the ghosts of Vietnam are buried in the sands of Saudi Arabia or Iraq. And it's decades, like 20 years at least, of trying to get away from Vietnam. And I think that's really messed with the United States going forward, trying to ignore something rather than learn from it.
Okay. We have a follow-up question from Enrico on this, just very quickly, and then maybe we'll hear, I see we have a question from the floor as well. It says here, in relations to Prof. Hussein's remarks, what do you think the wrong lessons learned, taken from Vietnam War and so on? Or if it is sort of specific to pacification or any type of low intensity, I guess, method of conflict, which you carry over, of course, by the US military and so on, at least until the global war on terror sort of campaign. That's a fair point from Enrico.
It's a good question too. The wrong lesson.
An obvious one, one that sort of sticks out.
Yeah,
yeah.
Like the U.S. one of the things the U.S. comes away with is thinking that special forces are the answer, that they'll do everything. They can be the answer going forward for like pacification and whatnot. So it's even the wrong lesson, that they can have specialized teams that'll take care of it. No one else really has to learn about it. There's a couple, I've talked to others who are like, you know, the US Army has no business in pacification, in policing, but it fails to take into account that it helps create the conditions that you need its assistance. You need it to bring in the support, because whatever has been destroyed, the infrastructure is destroyed. It also has like the assets financially, physically to do pacification. It's just that it doesn't want to do it because it's not seen as glamorous. And then you have the ghost of Vietnam making it like, you know, we don't want to fail at it again. And now probably also we have the ghost from Afghanistan, Iraq, that we've not done it well. And so if anything, the biggest wrong lesson that comes out of the Vietnam War is that we're not going to do another Vietnam. That you know, other smaller entities will take care of it. We're not going to deal with it. There won't be another one, and there have been at least 2 since.
Hamlet sees a ghost as well. So anyone else? Is there? I see someone from the circle. I think was it? Who was it? I saw that.
I have a question for Dr. Robert. So, I mean, okay, during the 1970s, during the pinnacle of the Vietnam War, it was the time where the counterculture was on the rise in America, where you can see like hippies driving Volkswagen, you know, fighting for social justice values, because they want to reject their parents' cultural standards, especially with respect to racial segregation, gender equality, and especially the Vietnam War, where it was the first televised war in the history. So did this counterculture affected the American government from winning the Vietnam War? I mean, indirectly or directly?
Of course it did.
Yeah, definitely. The anti-war movement played a big part in the U.S. needing to get out of Vietnam. The war had become immensely unpopular. And then there was you know, the accusations of like famous Americans like going to Hanoi, and the anti-war movement was massive. It had different elements to it, some far more left than others, but it's probably been the only time in American history where enough people protested and made it a part of everyday life that the U.S. government couldn't ignore it. And so the anti-war move definitely played like a huge role in getting the U.S. out of Vietnam, and it it changed the political, changed the presidential election. So it was definitely massive. And I know in South Vietnam there were worries about just what those ramifications would be. Like, is it going to mean the end of U.S. support this year? So it had far-reaching ramifications.
Milza has a question as well, I think.
Yes, assalamualaikum. Good
Simon.
morning, everyone. So my name is Usemi Manalai, and I am a fourth-year student of International Relations and Political Philosophy. Thank you, Dr. Robert, for sharing so much with us on the issue. So I think you mentioned earlier about this article published in the New York Times and how you were unwilling to take credit for the publishing because of the editors. But I saw it and I was really interested if you could share with us about the coining of so the title is Pacification Through the Barrel of a Gun. So I think that there's a hint of irony in that title. I was thinking, okay, perhaps you were the one who coined this title. Very interesting article about how pacification simplified the war. So could you tell us a bit on how this article it reflected your views on pacification? Thank you.
It's a great question. I haven't thought about that article in a few years. So that was my first attempt at trying to explain what I was doing. I had just finished my dissertation, and that was my first opportunity to, I guess, share my work with outside of my small committee circle. So I was approached by the New York Times for their Vietnam 67 anniversary series to cover pacification. And that's where I really tried to drive home this idea that conventional warfare and pacification were pretty much the same thing. And yeah, I love that title. If I remember correctly, they came up with it the New York Times editor came up with it on their own. But I do have a primary source from an American advisor who was in Phu Yen that says that's pretty much the same thing. I think his comment was staring down the barrel of a gun. So it was interesting that everyone's kind of in their own way coming to that realization. But for Phu Yen, that's how I felt. That's how I understood pacification, that it was being forced on people. And so that's one way to look at the metaphor. And then the other was that it was actual armies creating the space for it to happen or doing it themselves. But either way, it was happening in war. So yeah, I'm trying to remember more about that article. I believe I also touched on the different, what people thought pacification meant. So in a way, if you read that article, you have a pretty good idea of what to expect in the first chapter in my book about pacification, that I kind of condensed it into a newspaper article. I go into far more detail, but the idea is the same. Yeah, that conventional warfare and pacification, yeah, they do help simplify the war if you let them, and that everything in Vietnam falls. I think it is pacification. It's like the umbrella term that the Vietnam War can fall under. That everything's about trying to control people and territory, and pacification does that, and then the rest of the war follows that one word.
One more question I see here. Is it Milza?
Yes, I have a question. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, so hello everyone, good morning, and hello Dr. Robert. So I have a question with regard to the Agent Orange, the chemical dieting that was used during the war, and which later proved that it has serious health issues on the soldiers and also the civilians, especially the children. So how did the US reacted after that, and did they have any feeling of guilt after what happened to the consequences of people and their health issues.
That's yeah. Agent Orange is still I would say it's still a controversy at some point. The U.S. has admitted to using it. I know there are veterans in the U.S. who are exposed to it who have died. A lot of them have, or are facing their own health issues because of it. I was in Vietnam in 2011, and we went to a workshop that was mostly populated by the children who were born with defects because of Agent Orange. And so that's been my only like face-to-face experience with it, and it's horrific. We were then let's see, I think we were near, during my time there, we went near Hue. So if anyone remembers Tet Hue, when we were outside of Hue, we were told that where we were at, there were like, there's no foliage when the Americans left. Agent Orange and other chemicals we used had completely deforested that area, and that the only reason why there was green, or there were like trees there, is because of the Australian government had helped replant eucalyptus trees that would stay in the environment. So that like has always had me wondering if the U.S. has done enough. I only recently, maybe the past 3, 4, 5 years, has Washington D.C. and Hanoi been like talking. I want to see maybe 4 or 5 years ago, a U.S. Warship made a stop, and that was kind of like the start. I know President Trump went a couple of years ago to Hanoi, and so relations are getting warmer. Other than that, I know that the U.S. has spent a lot of effort working with the Vietnamese government for locating the remains of missing U.S. service members, and a part of that is also helping the Vietnamese government look for its own missing. I know some individuals who are helping with that, but yeah, there's still a lot of guilt. I wasn't alive during the time of Vietnam, so it's hard for me to really, I guess, understand that level of guilt, perhaps. But having been to Vietnam, having Vietnamese friends, yeah, it doesn't sit well with me. It's a good reminder that for all the good that my country wants to do, the ways it goes about doing it are often, yeah, really, really bad. To put it simply.
I think we've spoken about this before as well in one of our lectures as well. Like, it's difficult. One of the challenges of discussing tough situations is that we're not our fathers or our mothers and so on. Although it seems like sometimes we inherit some of the feeling of dilemma, the feeling of guilt and so on. But ultimately, sometimes we have to look past because we're not sort of. I wouldn't judge you on the sins of your father and so on. It's common sense which sort of disappears sometimes when we engage in a type of discourse like this. But interesting. I was wondering, Rob, if you're not too tired yet, if you could still.
Oh no, I'm
okay.
I'm still going.
Yeah, just one from me, because this whole discussion has brought to mind. Because going back to Fujian, is there anything from from your research and from the book and so on, from Fujian, does it tell us anything about? Is there any type of gender-based takeaway? Because I think the gender dimension on both sides, of course, especially on the Vietnamese side, is a type of a very sort of egalitarian fighting force. I mean, so they claim and so on, because the gender dynamics, them being sort of equal in that place. Is there something that we, because you also mentioned, that there was an attempt to make pacification look as if it was working. Is there anything from this moment that we can take away with regards to, is pacification unique to, does it target a certain gender or vice versa, or doesn't it? Is there anything we can say about pacification and how that works in the context of, having a situation with this?
That's a great question. That's something I want to pursue, maybe even for the next book, is that relationship between gender and pacification. My gut tells me there's a lot to it. I didn't see a lot in my own research, but I know the way that the U.S. Army's advisors, not all of them, but some of the files I have, how they viewed the South Vietnamese. They saw them as maybe not being manly, like that they were doing pacification work because they weren't good at fighting. So they questioned their manhood that way. During the Tet Offensive in Phu Yen, there was an attack made against the province capital by PAVN, and Arvin had been fighting them throughout the night. So we're talking like 7-8 hours of continuous fighting. So the morning comes and they're exhausted, and then the U.S. armor arrives to help relieve them. And there's some miscommunication about what the Americans are supposed to do, but Arvin takes it as a chance for a break to actually like eat. And the Americans are like angered by it. They see like, oh, the South Vietnamese, like the troops are, they question if they're really troops because they're not fighting. They're leaving everything to the Americans. So again, they're questioning like the manhood of the South Vietnamese. And that struck me as really odd because they're supposed to be allies, but if you didn't know any better, you thought they were the enemies, or at least the Americans are framing them that way. And so I think there's a whole lot more there. I'd like to explore it. I think Heather Sturr and her first book gets on that like how the U.S. views pacification. Arvin, it's not a manly thing to do. That's something for not, your alpha male. And I think there's that's something I want to look at more, just because the way the province reports are really rich with their vocabulary and their information. I think maybe if I look at other provinces or different, I'm trying to think, maybe different reporting bodies, maybe not just chords, but there might be a lot more to what she is saying in her book about it.
I suppose there's no sort of, at the time, maybe there's no nuance on the South Vietnamese or on the American side, because an enemy is an enemy, I guess, well, at least in the moment, no distinction between the gender and so on. But it's interesting because as you've mentioned, I think the stereotype over the South Vietnamese fighter goes something along the lines of they're small, but they carry more. They can live off the land, and they're sort of more sort of durable in that sense. But they're not regarded as, in some sense equal, and that's an interesting takeaway, especially given that it was also in some sense local Vietnamese who were on both sides, and on the other, of course, on the other side, you had the participation of the female fighters in general, and they were regarded as sort of equally as competent as well. It's interesting.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of racism, and there's a lot going on with that, the relationship between the average American soldier and their South Vietnamese counterpart.
Yeah. Would you say it's almost unavoidable? Because you see the same happening in prior to Vietnam and Malaya as well, because it seems extremely important to be able to sort of define your enemy in a way, and define it in such a way that's convenient for you.
Right.
And does that mean does it mean pacification immediately means a type of unity and effort, a type of Templar moment happening everywhere, and then it leads to this notion of control and I don't know, it's hard. Eventually the question becomes, is hearts and minds quite literally simply just force, or is it hearts as well? Is there something we can take away from Phu Yen on this?
Well, the U.S. has always had a problem with race. that's easy to trace through our history.
Yeah.
The Second World War makes it, that really clear how we treat the Germans different from like the Japanese, like in our propaganda. Where if you look at any of the U.S. propaganda for the Pacific theater, it's just, there's racism everywhere. It's making the Japanese like inferior, like monsters. And I think that racism is still firmly attached when the U.S. goes to Korea and then Vietnam. I mean, you have this, the officers who are in charge in Vietnam. That, I mean, they were younger officers in World War II. So there's that racism they bring over, and I think that's the lens they see a lot of what's going on. This is like Fujian,
part of American military culture.
and so it's like all the problems they see are happening in Fujian. It's because the South Vietnamese they don't know better. The Americans have to teach them. The French failed to teach them the right way. The Americans are going to do that. But then the joke is on the Americans, because what they're trying to get the South Vietnamese to do is incompatible with the war itself. Never mind like the province's future. Like you pointed out, it's I wouldn't say it's like brother against brother necessarily, but it's communities against communities. There's parts of Fujian that are firmly under communist control, and they're fighting the other side of the province that's maybe under Saigon's control. But it's a civil war. That is definitely sure. So I think maybe Fujian's probably a great way to see how, empires don't really know what they're doing. They could throw their weight around, but unless they really understand that local environment and are willing to stay there for an indeterminate amount of time, they're not going to prevail.
Is there, since we're in Fujian, and of course the class might be wondering as well, was there anything particular to the use of terror tactics in Fujian? Maybe was there something that stood out?
I was impressed. Yeah, I'll say impressed with the PLAF's use of terrorism, and very smart. They used it wisely. Yeah, there were times where they would mine local roads and you have civilians killed. But in 1971, they tried to take a district capital called Kung Sun. Like, I wrote an article about that battle, and I do a much better job in the book. And they have two local force battalions, one of which gets wiped out trying to take this town. U.S. air power helps the South Vietnamese win the day. So the province for this week is like, look at this great victory. Everything, we beat the communists again. Everything's going well. And then days later, what does the PLF do? They blow up a span of this brand new bridge that President IIUM II had just cut the ribbon for like a day or two before. So a brand new bridge. They set off one charge to get the population to look at the bridge, and then they drop one span right into the river. And it's just this symbolism. Catches the attention of everyone from the American leadership, the South Vietnamese leadership. One American advisor makes the comment to another U.S. advisor, is like, "What do you see in that river?" And the guy responds like, "There's a span of a bridge down there." And he goes, "No. The province chief's full colonelcy is down there. Like, he's never going to get promoted again." So again, like, the communists knew where to strike and when, and to pull it off in such a way that everyone noticed they were still there, and it was minimum effort. A couple couple explosives, and they completely rid the province of any sense of victory at that earlier battle. That it was back to this, you know, balance, if you will.
Okay. I'll give Rob a bit of a break, just a bit by advertising the series. We're running this webinar series on global conflict as a part of a series. Incoming, we have a few more guests, and hopefully you'll be able to join us. There'll be one next Friday. I think you will hear from the committee. If you're familiar with them, they'll send you, they'll bother you, I think, harass you from this one onwards. Hopefully we'll have the thing will snowball and we'll speak again next Friday. But just to inform everyone, it's a series. Of course, then you know, we have a new year. I see. It seems like the new year will put a slight break on things, but we can return after the new year with a bit more strength, and we'll continue after the new year. There'll be events in January and February as well. So pass the word around, and hopefully we'll see the ones here. We'll see you again, hopefully. But keep in mind, if you've enjoyed the discussion here, Rob, please speak fondly of us when you leave.
Oh, absolutely.
People, you know, if they asked you how we were, but hopefully this will continue. Izzadin is there, the program manager, I think, and you heard from Zuleika. So I'm quite pleased to be here. Thank you everyone for hosting us, and well done, and thank you everyone who's involved. I think there's maybe two more questions. The last two I can see from Zoom here. Zuleika, was it? Did you have something to say or ask? Was it? Oh, who was it?
Okay, I have a question. Thank you so much to Dr. Robert and Dr. Meor Alif. I would like to ask about can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Was the process of the Vietnamization is mistake or a matter of wrong timing, as Northern Vietnamese forces had fully acquired dominance in Phu Yen as opposed to the unreadiness of the South Vietnamese state to become fully independent? What do you think? Thank you.
That's another great question. So I think the problem, the US is fighting a war that it shouldn't have been fighting to begin with. It should have been, I believe that South Vietnam had every right to exist. I think the US went about it the wrong way. It took over the war where it should have been assisting. And it based it on some very negative views of ARVN, of the Army of South Vietnam. So when we get Vietnamization, we have something that it should have always been South Vietnam's war to fight. And then when the US starts Vietnamization, it does it in a way that places the burden on the South Vietnamese really quick and without much concern for what they now have to do largely on their own. And I don't see it as a reflection of the South Vietnamese' inability to fight. I just think they're handed an unfair deal, that they don't have necessarily the right equipment. The US kind of like dumps new equipment and it's like they'll figure it out. So it's a lot of rush. It's giving South Vietnamese a lot of responsibility really quick. And in the case of like Phu Yen, it goes from the Americans doing everything, and then within a year, it's like, well, now the South Vietnamese can do everything. It'll be fine. And then they realize, oh, we didn't really set them up fine, in a way too bad. So I think instead of maybe seeing it as the US leaving Vietnam, it's more like an abandonment. they try to do it in a way that doesn't look like it, but ultimately that's what it is, that they don't need an independent South Vietnam anymore, despite South Vietnam wanting to be independent.
Okay. Okay. I hope, is that fine? Okay. Good. Good to see you smile. And one more. Finally, I think there's one more. Was it? I saw it here. Arena, was it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Good. So hello. Good morning. I guess it's still morning here. Okay. I have a question to Dr. Rob. So since it's stated that you're working with the Army Press, I would like to know how did the Vietnam War affect the journalism or the culture of Army Press there?
Good question. So as much as the US Army hasn't really wanted to learn about its mistakes in Vietnam, it has done a really good job writing about Vietnam. They're actually still working on some of the official histories, but the ones they have completed, which is most of them, are really good. They don't sugarcoat anything. They lay it out like it is, which is really impressive. And then there's even some reports like on like the lessons that we assumed like the Army is learning, like they're written out. This is what we should be taking away. Whether anyone's taking those to heart is debatable. So at least in terms of like the textual discussion, that it's healthy, it's there. All those reports are, I believe, yeah, free to download online. The US government has them out there. Anyone can get a PDF version of them. Some of them, again, they're really good. If it's from the Center of Military History, they're going to be a little bit more in depth. They're going to give a lot bigger history. And they really, I hope more people read them. Let's put it that way, because they're a wealth of information. And there's anything else that we've, and then we also do have, probably the next best thing is that after the Vietnam War, there's a lot of South Vietnamese refugees. Everyone's probably heard of like the boat people and the influx of South Vietnamese fleeing to the United States. And they settled throughout the country. But in Washington, D.C., you have a lot of the ARVN officers with their families moved to like Northern Virginia outside of Washington, D.C. And eventually they write the South Vietnamese Army perspective for the US Army. And those are great because they help you understand how the South Vietnamese saw the American War. And there's a few of those. I use some of them in the book. And I think they're from like 1979, 1980, and they're pretty honest. They lay out like they were fighting with nothing in terms of like allies and equipment. And there's a lot to learn from those. There's been at least a healthy textual dialogue.
On this point, then maybe you can share how we can get your book. I hear it's on pre-order at the moment. Perhaps say a bit on this, because some of us are quite interested, I think, at this point.
So you can pre-order the book through Amazon. I'm not sure how the international part works. You can also pre-order it directly from the press, which is Oklahoma University Press. And I can share links. I think I could put one in. Might be able to put one in the chat.
I mean, it would be nice to have a few copies for the library as well.
I'm trying to think where I'll put the one for the press. that.
Okay.
And then
Okay.
that'll at least give you like the information, the publishing stuff. And if you want to do it through Amazon, you can. I don't know who else is distributing it. I just know they're the two main ones I've been made aware of.
I'll pass
Yeah.
it as and when.
When? Oh, that's a better question. So it looks like it'll be at least probably end of April, early May for the US release. I don't know how that works internationally. I should probably ask that. But I at least know that the book will be ready in print by at least early May 2021.
Okay. Okay. So I think what I'll do, since we're close to time, because I see there's still a few questions coming in. We'll end on a question statement, because I think I can combine the two things here that I'm seeing, and then we'll take it from there, and perhaps end on that note, because I feel like that was where I was heading as well, in terms of how to conclude this. We have here from one of the participants. It's asking from Joe. It says here, the bridge sounds like, well, it sounds like, he says it sounds like the true last domino in the domino theory is the American presidency. I was wondering myself, like, from Fu Yen, where does the, butt end? Is it Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson? I mean, this is we're wondering who's to blame in some sense, right? And of course, and then there's one more question from Amar. It says, what's the lessons which we can learn from of course the events of things, and how do we best contextualize the consequences of the war in Vietnam for us today? I think these are similar questions, like how do we proceed? What is the main sort of takeaway, and so on?
All right. So I agree that bridge is pretty symbolic. It's a great metaphor for the war in general, not just Phu Yen, but in all of Vietnam, that as soon as you think there's progress, there's something to detract from it. It definitely, yeah, I agree. It's definitely one of those dominoes, and I'm, and it might sound strange, but I'm kind of glad that it happened, because that really helped make that chapter, that the Vietnam War wasn't going anywhere. So if we're trying to think, and then on the other hand, we're trying to think like how to contextualize the consequences, the lessons. The first one, it's empire building is hard. And I think that's what the Americans have to relearn, that in the 20th century, there's media, it's on print and television. There's like a closer public scrutiny of what's going on. If you go back to when America first starts like expanding overseas, you can look at the Philippines, how brutal that was. You had some journalism, but you didn't have an ABC news crew with a camera, or an embedded combat photographer, journalist interviewing troops after a battle. So yeah, trying to expand your influence through the barrel of a gun is not easy. It's probably not going to go well. And I think Vietnam proves that America isn't invincible, that it can't just make other locations do what they want it to do. And that's probably a lesson that a lot of the Europeans already learned at this point. The British, the French, the Americans thinking we're better than the rest. See that happen. I think they know that's the lesson. Whether we've actually like accepted it is a whole other question. I'm not convinced we have, just based on the last 20 years. So yeah, I think then the other part of that would be actually like facing those lessons, accepting them, learning from them, and trying not to repeat the same mistakes in the future. That makes sense.
Okay. Thank you, Rob. That was fantastic. And thank you as well to those tuning in on Facebook. I think it's a stream. I hear there's a fair few viewers there as well. And we've had fine company today, both in the audience and also the speaker, of course. I saw some familiar names, some colleagues. Thank you for making it. I think the students have benefited greatly as well. And I told you we'll put some end to the needless confusions over pacifism, pacification, and the Pacific. So I hope
we did.
Yeah, I hope so. So thank you very much for the insightful session. We appreciate it. Rob, keep in touch. And we'll be more than happy to hear from you again at some point if you wish.
Oh, absolutely. Feel free to contact me with any questions. Always happy to discuss Vietnam, pacification. So this has been a great experience for me. So thank you, Dr. Meor, and thank you, Izzadeen, for putting this together. I'm very happy.
We look forward to your book, and we wish you well and all the best. Especially in especially in this COVID sort of moment for us. I'm quite happy because, the world seems closed, but we're quite open anyway because we're able to have these types of events, and otherwise this wouldn't have been. I mean, I would imagine something like this would have been quite difficult to organize if not for the virus and so on. So it's bittersweet, just like Vietnam. It's bittersweet, I think.
Okay. They work well together.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we'll end the session with the recitation of the Speak for us, and I think you know how to reach out to Rob if you wish. His email is there. His website is there as well. He has a Twitter account as well. So please, and hopefully we'll have a lasting sort of friendship, as I mentioned earlier, sort of pure Aristotelian sort of friendship. Okay, thank you everyone, and hopefully we'll see you tomorrow, next week. Oh, tomorrow, I'm so excited. Next week, hopefully. We'll have another set of speakers incoming, so hopefully we'll get there. Thank you everyone, and Assalamualaikum. Take care. Thank you for your time. We appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for having me again.
Thank you, Dr. Robert.
Thank you.